Morning, good evening, good afternoon, wherever you are in the world. My name is Erik Bush. I'm the CEO and co-founder of Demand-Driven Technologies and delighted to be your presenter for today's webinar. Before we get started, a couple comments. We're going to be recording the webinar, so it will be available for review afterwards. We'll be sending out not only my presentation here, but also the links to that content. Everyone will be on mute, and we apologize for that, but it really helps improve our audio quality. But it does not mean that we're not interested in your questions. So please utilize the question feature in your webinar control panel, not the chat feature, but the question feature. And at the end, we've saved time and we'll have time for Q&A. Today's webinar is really about the food and beverage industry, and really looking at how demand-driven MRP, this concept that's really become quite pervasive in the market, can really help companies that operate in the food and beverage industry improve their performance. So we're going to take a look at Ddmrp more through the lens of the business that you operate, some of the challenges that you face and the like. This session is a follow-on to last week's webinar, which we hosted with Barry Anderson of Coca-Cola Beverages Africa, one of our clients who've deployed our solution out to 7 countries in sub-Saharan Africa and have had great success. Hopefully you were able to attend that webinar. If you missed it, that link will also be available through our website, and you'll also see references to it out in social media. So this is really a follow-on to take a look now based on the kind of opportunity in the case study that Barry presented, kind of where some of the gears come together and how do we actually achieve those kind of improvements from a food and beverage standpoint. And the demo that we'll do, we'll follow the presentation, will kind of be focused in really more of that same industry-oriented context. So hopefully you'll get a real good view kind of how Ddmrp and Replenishment Plus can help in that environment. I borrowed this chart from Barry's presentation because I think it is so reflective of the challenges that companies are facing in your industry. For one thing, we see many, many new entrants. I think of this chart more from a right to left standpoint than the way Barry presented it in a left to right. But more and more, you're seeing niche providers joining your market, coming in with different flavors, different offerings, different focus in terms of the beverages that they provide. And this means that the competitive landscape is increasing, which is pushing more and more the requirement, especially for the more mainstream or established companies, to start to differentiate and try to find ways that they can offer products to compete with those niche providers. You've seen this heavily in the craft beer industry, where craft beers are now some 20-odd% of the industry sales. And it's really a remarkable achievement when you think about these companies that have really grown up pretty much over the last 10 years and are now starting to take a meaningful share of that marketplace. You're seeing the same thing happen with craft soda drinks and soft drinks. Obviously, energy drinks really became a big thing over the past several years as well. So suffice to say, if you're in beverage, it's a very, very challenging and difficult landscape to work within. And the result of that is you end up with skew proliferation, which, in Barry's case, he talked about nearly doubling their SKUs in about an 18-month time frame. And the challenge with that from a material planning and a supply chain planning standpoint really hits the planners, because typically the planner community doesn't grow with the number of SKUs that you're offering. And as a result, they have less time to focus on each individual item, putting them in a more and more difficult position going forward. So let's use this as a bit of the backdrop. I've also written a white paper about this that's available on our website and has been out on social media as well. So if you're interested, you can get a copy of that as well to review after the session. So again, the context is, let's take a look at how Ddmrp really can help in the food and beverage industry. One of the things that we found so compelling about the methodology, just in a general context, is that companies are getting better on time in full order fill rates. They're seeing reductions in inventory and getting away from this bimodal inventory, which we'll talk about here shortly. They're seeing that they can compress their planning lead times by really ensuring that they've buffered key components and materials that go into their products, allowing them to have shorter frozen periods and more flexibility from a scheduling standpoint to meet changes in the market demand. The buffering technique, which you're going to learn about today, is going to help you reduce the impact that variation occurs, that creates. And really, it's a dampening effect that really reduces the impact that the well-known bullwhip effect has on organizations and their operations. And then finally, as I think you're going to see in the software, it's a very easy and intuitive way of planning. In some ways, people will say it's a bit too simplistic, but my view is that the more understandable, the more the user can trust in the information that the system is going to provide, the more effective they're going to be in terms of managing their responsibilities. This is just a view of our global client base. We are the global leader now in terms of Ddmrp implementations around the world. You can see the application has really been useful in a wide range of industry segments, including obviously consumer goods, which is what we're focused on today, but as well automotive, electronics, heavy industrial environments, even healthcare. So, you know, that's kind of to me, a validation that the concepts of the method and the use of the software can be really effective in a wide range of environments. So let's talk about the challenges that are out there. What is so different about Ddmrp from the standpoint of the conventional method? You know, if we think about it, the vast majority of companies are using material requirements planning, or MRP, pretty much the way it was originally codified back in the 70s. Literally, this method has been around now for almost 50 years. Back then, in the 70s, there was really a lot of paper-based and manual reorder point kind of techniques that companies were using. My former employer, IBM, that I had worked with for 30 years, had started looking for ways to use computer logic to help drive out the requirements for a company. So if you had a forecast and you had a bill of material, and the lead times, you could explode that forecast down and determine what your requirements would be for the items you needed to buy, manufacture, and then package and sell into the market to meet that forecast. Very logical, very, very much a calculator, if you will. But it starts with one very, very flawed assumption, and that's that your forecast is going to be accurate. And as you can imagine now, with skew proliferation and things that have changed since that era, which was really much more of a, you know, push and promote kind of model in terms of market, you know, where companies were just making stuff and pushing them into the market, we clearly need to be in much more of a pull-based concept. The result of those inaccurate forecasts for companies is this bimodal distribution, where we end up with too much of the wrong stuff, too little of the right stuff, too much inventory in aggregate, and at the same time, we're still not shipping on time. We're not achieving our on-time and full order fill rates. And Barry's presentation does a great job of illustrating how they've achieved improvements in their key performance metrics, their KPIs, while at the same time forecast accuracy didn't make any progress at all. And so the result of that is users get driven into using spreadsheets or other ad hoc means. Companies craft their own way of planning because they don't trust the data that's coming out of their MRP module for a lot of good reasons. And as a result, you've got this proliferation of non-standard methods that are, you know, kind of at the core of the challenge that's out there. I love this cartoon because it kind of, to me, captures what's going on. If you've ever shopped for Oreos, which is a favorite of mine, you know that you can get lots of different stuffing levels, you can get lots of different pack sizes, you can get fat-free, you can get all these different options. And it's kind of a picture of what's happening in the market from a consumer goods standpoint that I always think is quite humorous, except if you're on the producer side, this is kind of the maddening part of the business where as things continue to progress, it gets harder and harder and harder to do a job in a good fashion. And kind of the consequence, and this is a chart I've borrowed from the Demand-Driven Institute, this is what the bullwhip effect is all about. If you look at this chart, you can see this wavering line in the middle is representative of the point of sale actual demand for this item. This happened to be a personal care product from a large consumer goods company, but very, very emblematic of how the bullwhip effect occurs. You can see it kind of fluctuates up and down, but the overall average is not moving much at all over that time horizon. But when you look at shipments, you can see there's a much larger level of variation. Every layer we go back from the consumer, we start to see amplification of the variance in terms of the demand and supply signals. And then when we get all the way back to production, we can see even more distortions. This was given to us by a client, and to me, it's such a perfect example of what everybody experiences. They talk about the bullwhip effect, and it's very much a byproduct of when you're using an unreliable demand signal to start your planning, okay? So what's about Ddmrp? Well, we've got the relevant aspects of material requirements planning. There's still good elements of that methodology that we can make great use of, coupled with the pull-based concepts of lean and theory of constraints. Both those methodologies came out after MRP was initially brought to the market. Both lean and theory of constraints really kind of got their momentum in the mid to late 80s. Both of those are premised on the idea that we're going to pull to actual demand, knowing that it's going to be a more reliable signal to work with. There's a lot of innovative thinking that the founders of the Demand-Driven Institute, Chad Smith and Carol Patak and their colleagues, created along the way of stitching these methods together in a way that's delivering those kind of performances that I mentioned earlier. So what's so different? The basic premise is we're going to move away from a forecast-driven planning signal, what is our true demand, to something that is far more accurate. We'll call it sales order demand today, but it's anything that really represents true consumption, true pull to the market. No one will argue that true sales is a better indication of demand than a forecast will ever be. It's what's actually coming into us that's going to convert into cash, whereas forecasts are simply an estimate of that. The challenge has been is that, well, wait a minute, I have to ship within 24 or 48 hours. My lead times are longer than that. So how in the world can I wait till I get the order from the customer to actually start the process going? So I have to have material available, and that's why I do forecasting. And yes, I know my forecast is inaccurate, but I don't know a better way to get there. So how are we actually going to do this? And this is really, to me, having been doing this now for 10 years, the guts of what Ddmrp is all about. It's the idea that we're going to design buffers to ensure constant availability. If the material is always available, why do I need a forecast? Right? I can now use a better, cleaner demand signal to drive my planning. So the question becomes not about is sales orders a better demand signal than forecast. It's about how do we configure a buffer, a stock position, to ensure we've got constant availability. And it's real simple, but it's really effective. Let's start with the zones in the Ddmrp buffer. Yellow zone is where we start. Size to cover usage over the lead time. If my item is being consumed at 1,000 per day and I have a 10-day resupply lead time, then I'm going to have 1,000 units in my yellow zone. My reorder point in Ddmrp is top of yellow. So if I go below top of yellow in my planning equation, which we'll cover in a moment, and my lead time is achieved, and my usage rate is achieved, the 1,000 per day, and I get that 10-day lead time, the material is going to arrive at bottom of yellow. And I know many of you are out there saying, well, wait a minute, that's never going to happen, right? And I agree, 100%. Lead times may vary. We may be getting a supply late from the supplier. We may have a delay in manufacturing that finished good, so we have to be able to compensate for this. Our rate of demand could be different than what that usage rate is that's sizing the buffer. And so what we do is we size the red zone, think of it like safety stock, but it behaves differently, as our protection against variation. And really the core of this is about learning how to manage variation more than it is about getting a more accurate forecast. If I understand how my items behave from the levels of variability they experience, then I can size these red zones to cover for that, to get me to this better availability, constant availability, which then allows me to use a more accurate demand signal. This is the heart of where we're going to get a differentiated value prop from the use of Ddmrp. Items with heavy variation will be sized with a much thicker red zone. Items with lower variation will be skinnied down. And so it's that analysis and understanding of the way your items behave that really reflects how you will set up your Ddmrp buffers. For example, if we have items that are only consumed by one customer and we never know when they're going to order, that's going to have a fat red zone. If we have items that are consumed by lots of customers and have relatively stable demand, we're going to have a skinnier red zone. There is the point where we will say our demand is so irregular, it doesn't make sense to carry inventory of this item. We'll do it on a make to order or buy to order kind of a basis. So we're going to size this again to protect against variation, and that's really the goal of what we're trying to do. I see an alert here. I'm going to just check. Okay, I think we're all okay. So now that we know that we can protect constant availability, getting us to this better, more accurate demand signal, how are we going to determine what we're going to order? Well, typically there's going to be a minimum order quantity or a batch size, or we may be on some kind of an order cycle where we want to produce this item once a week. And so at that point we would say, okay, we're going to take 7 days times our average rate of demand over that, over our lead time, our rate of consumption, to size the green zone. And that way it'll trigger a resupply order roughly once a week. And this gives us a better way to manage. Some folks are in kind of a rhythm kind of planning technique in consumer goods and F&B, where you're trying to run a given product once a week because you've got fairly ready pull from the market, and that's the best way to plan. In other cases, you're going to have minimum order quantities, like from suppliers for packaging or other materials that you bring into your goods. You need to respect those minimum order quantities. If I have a large MOQ, for example, let's say I've got an MOQ of 3,000 and my rate of, if I have let's say a rate of usage of 10 per day and my MOQ is 300, then I'm going to order this roughly once every 30 days. So sometimes your minimum order quantities will dictate a longer order frequency than you would have had otherwise. One of the best things, though, about Ddmrp is it also has this overtop green zone. It tells you when you've gone too far. You either have too much inventory, too much supply, or too much of both. When we start most implementations, over half the client's items are in overtop of green. And after they implement, they gradually are able to dissipate that, burn those inventory levels down. It also serves as an indication when we're planning beyond the metrics of our planning tool, where we're buying double to stay out of trouble. So from a management standpoint, it also provides great visibility to help ensure that we're following our method, we're using the planning process the way it's been designed. Now, when we use this buffer logic, we're not using just on-hand inventory. We're going to use what's called the Netflow equation, where we take on-hand inventory plus open supply, and from that, we're going to take the demand orders due today or in the past. Why not tomorrow? Why not the day after? Why not in 5 days? The idea, and this was one of the concepts borrowed from theory of constraints, is you wait as long as possible before taking an action. Why? Because a future event can always change. Even though it may be a sales order 5 days out, it could get changed. It could get delayed. It could get canceled. It could get increased or decreased. We've designed the buffer to respond to today's demand and support that. So we have a much more responsive on-demand kind of a system. However, we will take future demands if they're big enough to jeopardize this constant availability. And typically those are going to be sized as more than 50% of the size of the red zone for that item. If they're bigger than that, we'll include that in our demand equation. That changes our net flow position, and we'll plan accordingly. That way we protect constant availability. The first and foremost principle of Ddmrp isn't inventory reduction, it's improving your order fill rates. So that's the goal that we're really trying to go after, because that improves revenue, that helps us grow, that helps us compete more effectively in the market. It just happens that we get these inventory reductions because we get away from following such an inherently inaccurate demand signal called a forecast. Now that we've got this established and we understand and can really grapple this idea of constant availability, now we can see how we can decouple our supply chain. Points of independence are created when we create Ddmrp buffers, which have many effects. They decouple lead times, so we can have a shorter planning horizon, which also actually reduces the size of the buffer. They also dampen variation from cascading through. And instead of trying to forecast across this whole view, we're going to let the buffers pull from one to the other like a Kanban loop would, a true consumption-based kind of a system. This is why companies are getting much more responsive lead times. They're seeing a much more flexible and stable operating environment. Clearly, if I have gone from say a 30 or 40 day frozen period down to one that's 8 or 9 days, I'm going to have more schedule stability. So if I'm the guy on operations side, I'm going to be happier because you're not interrupting my schedule as frequently because of crisis firefighting that you're doing, because your schedule doesn't align to what's actually happening in the market. Now, so let's turn the coin here, and now let's start to talk about how would this apply into food and beverage. And let's use bottling as an example, because that was our case study that we went through last week. let's view this as kind of a generic bottling environment. And those of you who've been in the industry should recognize a lot of this. Food and beverage, or food would be a little different, and I'll just talk about some of those differences. You've got the mix, let's call it the mix, which is the ingredients that are going to go into your, whether it's a carbonated soft drink or it's an energy drink or whatever it is you're making, there's some ingredients that go in, and typically those are going to be buffered because you're going to be making these on an ongoing basis. The mix that you produce that's going to go into the bottling line typically isn't going to be buffered because in most cases, these are contiguous production lines where the mixing is done, the preforms for the bottles are brought in and expanded and then used to capture the fluid or the beverage that you're making. There's carbonation that you're going to need. You're going to have labels, closures, and other elements of part of the packaging side of things that are all going to feed into this kind of continuous production line called a bottling line. Canning line would be very similar. Instead of preforms, you're going to have cans and lids. You're not going to have labels or to worry about, but basically the flow is going to be very similar, where we're going to buffer the vast majority of these items. Where would there be an exception? Let's say in some cases, companies have used kind of promotional caps that have a little, you get a reward after you open the bottle, where you get a free carton of Coke or Pepsi or whatever. So those items that are promotional are going to be one-time events. Those typically are going to be not buffered. You're going to bring them in and use them for a limited period of time during that promotional period. So you won't necessarily buffer all your closures. You're going to have packaging things like layer boards, stretch wrap, and shrink wrap that are all going to be consumed in the process. These are going to be kind of universal, whereas a lot of times your preforms, your labels, and your closures are obviously going to be very specific to the finished goods SKU. So there's some interesting relationships. These are more shared components. These would be shared. The rest are going to be unique to the end item that we're producing. Pallets, there's a lot of times the packaging end of the line also includes the palletizer. So those are all going to be typically brought in, and there's kind of those are returning materials as they recycle through the market. They'll typically not going to be buffered through Ddmrp. Oftentimes that production site is also serving as a warehouse and maybe servicing local demand through its stock buffers of finished goods. The finished goods buffers are also going to be then used to go and feed into finished good distribution centers or depots. Barry talked a little bit about that last week, which then go out to your end customers, which in some cases you may have retailers here, big commercial retailers like the large grocery chains in the US and Europe, or you may have, conventional trade, kind of more traditional trade, smaller outlets and things like that. So, you're going to, in beverage and food, you're going to typically see quite a high concentration of items that can be using Ddmrp buffers. And then obviously you're really going to get a lot of leverage in this. If I have more of a make to order kind of environment, let's say I'm a second tier producer in the food and beverage where I make ingredients or I make items that go into the final finished goods producer, like some of our other clients, sometimes you're going to be in more of a make to order. So it may have a little bit different flavor for you in terms of what your Ddmrp model is going to look like. On the food side, a lot of times you're sourcing other items from Asia, like spices or packaging goods or things like that. So the model will vary a bit, but you'll kind of get a flavor, I think, by looking at this example of how we would apply Ddmrp buffers. It's not about putting them everywhere. It's being selective and putting them where we're going to get the most leverage. So there's 5 components to Ddmrp. It starts with strategic inventory positioning, and that really is what we're reflecting here, where we look at how we've placed the buffers. It's not on all the items, it's on some of the items where we're going to get the most leverage. Buffer profiles and level, the next step. It's not about you calculating each and every item's buffer zones. There's a concept called a buffer profile where we're going to take items with like attributes and use a profile that says for these attributes, like similar lead times, similar levels of variation, we're going to drive out and take the individual items attributes, its specific lead time, its average rate of usage, its levels of variation, and it's going to then generate the buffer zone values for you. So the software does all that work. That really makes the administration and the management of this much, much easier to handle because you don't have to try and figure it out individually one by one through all your items. The buffers flex automatically. They're tied to your rate of demand. And so they're going to be adjusting up and down through time. And we'll show you this in the software in a couple different ways as it reflects the rate of demand and how that's occurring. From that, then, we know we've got constant availability protected. We've chosen the right items to use this method on. We've built profiles that make sense for the levels of variation and other factors. They're flexing dynamically to reflect changes in ongoing demand. Now, when we get to demand-driven planning, that's the process of generating resupply orders. And then execution, which is the process of managing open supply. So in step 4, I'm making sure that I've got an active pipeline coming in to keep those buffers stocked up, maintaining constant availability. But at the same time, I need expedites and execution alerts that help me focus on supply situations where I may have a misalignment. And we'll touch on those when we get into the software here shortly. This is all part of what's called the adaptive enterprise, or the demand-driven adaptive enterprise model. And this is, again, a chart from the Demand-Driven Institute. Demand-driven MRP is what's part of the demand-driven operating model, which covers materials and covers production scheduling and execution. The concept here is that your DDOM is pacing to actual demand in the market. On the right side, your company is evolving. We know that. Things are going to change. And you need to have an S&OP kind of platform where you're working through these things. Unlike conventional S&OP, though, where we're trying to get, as I would say it, all the stars and planets into alignment, in DD-S&OP, we're really more looking for exceptions. And you'll see this when we get into the advanced planning module, where we're looking to adjust our model to ensure that it paces to actual demand. If I could build my model flexible enough to deal with any demand that came at it, why would I need to do all of this heavy work around the company to plan where I'm going? I mean, there's purposes for all that, like new product introductions and things. But ideally, I want to make my demand-driven operating model flexible so that I can respond to actual demand. I get a better demand signal, not only for materials, but where I'm consuming my production resources, and I can pace my business in that regard. So we want to be thinking about this, and we'll highlight some of these factors. When you get into the APM, as we'll see here in a few minutes, you'll see how we use these more about adjusting the model than tying our business to that long-range forecast, right? Because we know inherently that's a dangerous proposition. We've got lots of success stories. You can get access to those on the website. We'll talk about that. Here's some examples in consumer goods or food and packaging, and healthcare for dogs and pets through Cormatec. And we also have another client, Almubas, in Spain that's using Ddmrp for their business. Oregon Freeze Dried, I think you may have heard about. Coca-Cola Beverages Africa. Consistent, sustainable results being achieved by these clients around the world. So with that, I'm going to take a break and jump over to the software. So we've moved over to Replenishment Plus, the world's leading Ddmrp software solution out in the market. We have over 100 clients around the world, and delighted that we have such broad coverage in terms of language support. We're up to 15 languages now, where the application's been translated into local language, and makes it much, much easier for users in manufacturing environments where English proficiency isn't so great. We're going to go through first a couple things on the site administration to give you an idea of how we can tailor and arrange the implementation of Replenishment Plus to meet your specific requirements. There are 16 user-defined fields which are very useful in capturing unique information from your ERP system that's relevant to the planner experience, and you'd like to bring those across. You can rename the fields to align to however they're displayed in your ERP system. You set the time zone that you're operating in, when you want your history data captured for the analysis reports. You can set decimal precision for all of your reports as well. There's a capability to configure your passwords to meet your corporate requirements, or you can also use single sign-in that we've enabled through Azure Active Directory. Very, very flexible, great way to have the access to your system configured when you can use single sign-on. Under the access and accounts and roles, we first establish roles, and this allows us to tailor specifically to an individual set of requirements what access within the application the user would have privileges to work with. So you can even include like read-only roles for vendors if you wish, to allow them to see their parts that they're supplying to you on your instance of R+. We license on an unlimited user basis, so it's really flexible in terms of giving people with various different responsibilities in your organization access to the system, perhaps in read-only modes, but specifically for those areas that they care about. Once you have the roles established, then you assign users to those roles. And this allows you to then set whatever filters you're going to have for like the locations, planner codes, other elements within the application. You can define all of the different roles that you've got, select and choose which ones you want to include for them. So very, very, very flexible kind of way of providing user access to the system. There's also a range of application programming interfaces or APIs. These are standardized and they stay consistent through the releases. This allows you to create other integrations with your ERP environment or other systems that you may be using. This is also the platform that's used to automate imports and exports from Replenishment Plus. Because of different data and number formats around the world, we've made it very configurable to meet the way data is represented in your systems. So this will really respect all the different regional parameters. You can also configure how for your rough cut capacity planning, what your run rates, how they're expressed, and whether it's units per hours per unit, or minutes per unit. So it's very flexible in that standpoint. The processing tab gives us access to a number of different elements that we can utilize to really tailor the way the logic within the application is going to work. We can bring in forecasted records and then create from that a forecasted daily usage figure, which would be one of the options for sizing your buffers. You can also turn the switch on to generate the child forecast, or the forecast for child parts, and explode that through your bill of material to create forecasted rates of usage for those items. That also enables us to do simulations of buffers forward in time through the advanced planning module to provide supplier forecasts, for example, of what your expectations are going to be on a rolling basis. You can bring in your average daily usage or your trailing rate of usage in with your part record. You can do the same on FDU. You can set the time horizons that you want those values calculated against. And there's also an option to exclude historical demand that is negative in value, because that could be accounting adjustments or other factors that really didn't represent true demand in the marketplace. There is a full MRP netting functionality. So as we net through the system, we can automatically generate the supply orders for non-buffered parts. This gives us great flexibility, and more our clients are migrating to where initially they were only managed their buffering parts in Ddmrp, but now they're really using Replenishment Plus for all of their material plannings. It really improves your user experience by being able to work entirely in one solution for their planning. There's also an auto approve function. This is something that a number of our clients are utilizing for certain types of materials. This way, once a replenishment order is generated, it's automatically approved, so a user does not need to intervene and go ahead and click the button. And I think this is really a reflection of the confidence and trust that they've got in the logic that we're providing with the Ddmrp buffering rules and the functionality of the software. Okay, so let's go back to the home screen. This is where we land when we come into the application. And it's really there to provide clear and visual priorities for the users. Planning, as we talked about, is the process of supply order generation. Where do we need replenishment orders? Anything in red or yellow will have order recommendations against it, because that's representing when the net flow has gone below top of green for those items. The execution alerts are really the other side of the coin. Planning is about making sure we have a pipeline of material coming, whether it's through suppliers or in our work orders. Execution is about making sure that we don't stock out. It's really kind of your expedite dashboard. And we'll go through this in a few minutes. But in summary, the current inventory alerts are going to be stockouts or stockouts with demand. The material synchronization alerts are going to be those situations that if they're critical, are going to stock out within the item's lead time, because we know that there is a misalignment between when supply will arrive and when demands are coming in. And then a high status there would be, it's not going to stock out, but it's still going to be deep in its red zone, and we ought to be paying attention to that. The projected stock out alerts are for those items that aren't in the first two categories, but based on their rate of usage, they're starting to get low in their current inventory levels, and so you may want to keep an eye on those. So we'll go through these alerts in a moment, but it really kind of illustrates there's two aspects of the planning job. One is to make sure I've got resupplies coming in, and the second is to make sure that I'm not stocking out. Again, this concept of constant availability is really kind of at the foundation of how Ddmrp focuses a user on where their true priorities are, and it allows us to shift to utilizing true demand in the market instead of forecast as our planning signal. So if you notice, you can go to each of the areas of the workbench based on these tiles, and we'll go to just the items that were in critical status. We can also open up the workbench to see all of the items, and you'll see that they're laid out in this fashion where reorder quantities are against all of those in red or yellow. And we've got great visibility to which items we want to focus on. But we've created a new workbench, and this is the kind of the default view that we would come into, where we've got a similar view to the view we just had in the initial workbench. But the reason why we've introduced this, and it's very pertinent in kind of the food and beverage space, is that we wanted to create a better user experience around group planning. If I notice here, while I'm working in this bottler 2 location, I've got a number of different production lines that I'm working with. Line 1 and 2, they have different pack sizes. Probably I want to do some grouping. And so let's try to sort first by and group first by the production lines that we're using. And then within, let's do material type, because when we run our 2-liter 6-packs, we want to run all of the SKUs we're going to produce in one go. It really saves us a lot of setup times because there's a configuration of the packaging line at the end of the production, the bottling line, that we would have to change every time we do a changeover. Obviously, there's going to be cleanouts between each of the material types, but it really improves our overall productivity if we can go in this fashion. And actually, we can create these and use them in save searches. So as we go ahead and start configuring different views, you simply can save them, create a new view, or save your current view. I'm going to go to one that's really a little more tailored to what I want to do, because it's going to be aligned not only to my production lines and my material types, but it's also going to show my recommended order quantities in terms of what the hours of production these represent. This really helps me align the order values that I'm reviewing. Are these within the footprint we want to operate when we run our next batch? You know, we're planning probably the week following, and we want to make sure that these are lined up. You can see now that we've got about 39 hours of production planned for the 2-liter packs, and we've got another 29 hours planned, so we've got about 68 hours of production. We may have 80 hours, you know, a 2-shift kind of operation in that week that we can work with, and so we're in pretty good shape here. And we may actually have some opportunities to top those up. But let's take a look at some of the functionality we've got here. As we can see here, this first item is in critical, and we have no inventory. We shouldn't be in this situation. In fact, this one's actually going to have one of those execution alerts. It's showing a stock out in a current inventory alert, which we'll get to here in a moment, because obviously we're going to want to approve this order and we're going to want to expedite it as quickly as possible. We can see more detail on the item by popping up this modal, which allows us to see all of the elements relative to that net flow equation, our inventory, our demand records. You can see this one is a spike because it's in the future, and it represents a value that's greater than 50% of our red zone. It's 147 units. If we go to our buffer sizing, our red zone is only 240 units, so it's clearly more than half of that value, and that's why it's showing up as an order spike. This view gives us access to those kind of details. If we had a material availability check, it would illustrate that as well. You can see just the supply orders. We don't have any, as we know, on this item. We can see the demand allocations. There's a buffer trend graph. This one's going to look a little distorted just because it's demo data, but it'll show kind of the evolving buffer trend. It shows us our part properties, shows us these different planning dimensions. You know, I can also see how many pallets I'm going to be creating with my production orders here if I wish. This one's configured to looking at the production time it's going to require. I can see my buffer profile values, which resource this is committed to, et cetera. So a lot of great information here. This one's using a forecasted rate of demand. And so that's going to be used to size the buffer zone values that you see in this tab here. It's going to show us our target inventory. Again, all of red plus half of the green zone is the formula in Ddmrp for our average on-hand inventory. And these are expressed in both units as well as days of coverage. A nice additional feature here is this modal can be popped out and moved to a secondary screen. And if we do that, what we'll see is as we cursor around to different items in our workbench, it's going to refresh. So if you've got a second monitor on your workstation, you can put the details panel over on that right side monitor. And as you browse through this, you'll be able to see the information that you're looking at for each of your items, a real productivity improvement. So it gives you a very deep view of your information. It allows for really great productivity from a planning standpoint. We can see all of the core elements of the Netflow in the grid: on hand plus open supply, my demand allocations equals my Netflow. If that's below top of yellow, I order to top of green. I have to respect my roundings, and that's going to result in what my recommended order quantities are for each of these items that we're going to be ordering here. So great visibility. I have the ability to collapse all, and I can see the summary views for each of my production lines and material types. It'll show me my reorder quantities. I also have a tremendous amount of control of moving, columns around on the grid and really configuring this. As I save these different views, then they persist, and when I refer back to them, they're going to be in great shape. If I expand all, I'm just going to go ahead then and we'll plan and approve all of the orders that we have for the first production line. This way they'll be generated. We know we're comfortable. The production volume that we're creating for line 1 is within the capacity that we have for the following week, and we'll go ahead and approve these orders. And what will happen now is those will move into what's called the Pended order table. And this is the table from which we're going to pull these back into our ERP system. So while that's processing, you can see here's the orders that we just approved. They're assigned a temporary number. When they come back after the next integration with the ERP system, they're going to reflect the actual order values that were created. We come back to our preview workbench. You can see now everything's in green. We're good to go from a planning standpoint. And this is really the way we would navigate and go through planning. It's very user-friendly. I can create as many of these saved views as I want. I have tremendous flexibility in terms of filtering and creating different dimensions, different ways of, kind of sorting my views down. So very flexible. We've gotten phenomenal feedback from our planners about this. So that's kind of the way planning is going to happen. When we come back to the dashboard now, we'll see that as we refresh here that we've cleared most of our planning priorities. We still have a few to do on that other production line, and we will go through the process of then clearing out those orders as well. So planning, very straightforward, very user configurable, very much oriented towards group planning, which is a real critical part of the process when you're running in food and beverage, where you've got certain SKUs that are going to run together. You want to, optimize the use of your packaging areas, your production lines, et cetera. You need to respect, product sequences and allergen sequences and other factors like that. So you can really tailor the way you utilize the workbench to give a great experience in that regard. Just for the sake of the demo here, I'm going to go ahead and cancel these out. But that's kind of the way we would handle planning from a Ddmrp standpoint. Okay, so now let's come back and let's take a look at our execution alerts. The current inventory alert, again, is a stock out or a stock out with demand. Material synchronization alerts are about situations where demand and supply are out of alignment and are going to happen within the item's lead time. If they're critical, it means that there's going to be a period where the items are going to stock out. And so we want to go take a look at these. You can see we've got supply order note badges, and these badges really help us track our progress. In this case, we've got 3 items that qualify in this alert category. 2 of them do not have supply order notes yet, and 1 does. So let's take a look at these, and I'm going to actually do this in the preview workbench as well. So we'll go to the alerts-oriented view that I had mentioned, which is now going to have my dashboard
organized by my alert statuses. You can see I've got my current inventory alerts, then my material synchronization alerts. We can see 2 of those 5 that were mentioned here in this bracket here. There's 5 items altogether. We can see 2 of them already have current supply order notes. And so let's go take a look at what that represents here. We'll go to this pop-up, and we can actually see what the supply order note represents. We can see that there's that this is going to come in on Monday. We've got some inventory, but we know demand is coming in. And if we don't take a corrective action, we could be in a difficult situation where we're below kind of that key threshold that we want to be at. So that's what that supply order note functionality is about. So let's look at the current, the high status or the critical status on the material synchronization alert. These are situations while we do have some inventory, we're not stocked out, so we weren't in that first alert category, but yet we have demand greater than what we have on hand, and we would be in a negative running balance position. We can see we've got a production order plan for the 22nd. And so let's say we talk to the operations side of the house and they say, yeah, we can run this, we'll run on this the 20th, which would allow us to finish that up. We're going to go ahead and create that supply order note, and it's going to change our status, right? And this is really what we're after, because we want to be able to give visibility. This supply order note can be visible to other people who have access to the system. This is, again, why we license in an unlimited user basis. There may be operation staff that you want to have visibility, even though they're not doing planning. This way they can use these kind of triggers, helps keep people in sync. If this was bought in materials, this would be great because your vendors would be telling you when the material is going to arrive. Great way to collaborate across the organization. When we come back and we refresh our view, then what we're going to see now is that we've got current check marks. And what we would want to see from a user standpoint is that we've cleared all of these. This first one, that's that full stock out. We're going to be expediting that. We'll go ahead and create a supply order note on that as well. When we come back to our workbench then, or our home screen, you'll see that we've increased the number of items that have current supply order notes. And that's kind of the planning discipline from an execution standpoint we want to be following. Again, planning is about resupply order generation. Execution is about expediting and making sure we protect this concept of constant material availability. Okay, so we've covered planning, we've covered execution. Let's talk about that future-looking view. We talked in the overview presentation about this idea of model configuration in demand-driven sales and operations planning. And this is really about using our advanced planning module to get a view into the future. If I'm in food and beverage, I'm typically going to have seasonal issues. I'm going to have promotional events. I'm going to have all sorts of other future activities that may influence the ability of my demand-driven operating model. In other words, my use of Replenishment Plus here, where the buffered values may be under pressure because of those known events. A promotion would be a great example. So what we're going to do is open up the advanced planning module screens here for our environment and take a look at the different views that we've got and understand what they're telling us. So let's jump over. Now, we talked about this idea of model configuration, and it's all about setting thresholds that really allow us to understand kind of the parameters that we're working within. It really is about exception management. So we've set thresholds in our various reports to help trigger alerts or notifications that really allow us to focus our attention where it's most appropriate. If it's not alerting, we shouldn't have to worry about it, right? The idea is to be on an exception management basis. Let the system continue to do its job. If the demand-driven operating model is in good shape and we don't need to make adjustments, let's not. Let's do less work so that we can focus on other things that really have a bigger priority. So we've set alerts here for projected inventory. Critical will be anytime the buffer projects to go below 0. High would be situations where we're below 40% of our red zone. 60% of our red zone would indicate a medium priority, and we're only going to look out 13 weeks because we know anything beyond that, we've got plenty of time to work around it. We'll deal with that when we get to it. It's likely to change before we get there anyway. So let's stay within this relevant range and really focus on those time periods. The promotion report is really about looking at our demand records and seeing if there's periods where demand is substantially different on a weekly basis than its average weekly demand. So if it's 2 times average, it's going to, or greater, it's going to be a medium priority. If it's 3 times average high, if it's 6 times average, it's going to be critical, because that would be a very, very major kind of promotional event. There's also alerting for daily usage. So if there's a substantial change in trajectory, you may have promotional events that really don't trigger the daily usage category, or more likely in a seasonal event, you'll start to see your daily usage values climbing based on FDU to EDU comparison, forecasted daily usage versus our effective daily usage. And this is where we want to see this, because in some of those cases, it could be a trend upwards or downwards. We may want to adopt a forward-looking rate of usage, because it's going to help the buffer stay more in line with what we expect is going to happen. Seasonal upswings, seasonal downswings. If it's a downswing, we want to slow down ordering so we don't overshoot the mark and end up with dead stock. If it's seasonal upswing, then we clearly want to make sure we get out in front of that. We're building materials to capture that seasonal demand. The rough cut capacity planning tool works in a similar manner, where we set thresholds relative to the resource capacity we have in a given period. 80% of capacity would be a medium priority. Right at capacity would be high. Anything above 120% would be critical. We can adjust these parameters, and again, we're going to look at it within a certain time horizon. We also look at it at a summary level, because we may want to see not only a given production line or production area or value stream, but we may want to expand that to how does the entire plant look. In often cases, we've got alternate routings that we can utilize, and we can start to evaluate whether we've got enough capacity in other areas of the plant to step up and handle peak areas if they, for the preferred resource, are not going to be able to be met with the existing capacity that we've got. So again, about exception management. So let's start taking a look at our reports. I always start with a promotion report, because it's really kind of that preview of what's going to be happening in the future. We filtered out any items that aren't alerting. We don't need to, right? Because that's not the purpose here. We're trying to be on an exception management basis. So we can see the various items. We've got a couple here down below that are going to have promotional events. You can see how demand is being consumed from the forecast as part of the way the simulation is running. It's going to project supply orders. Here's one that's actually in the system, and then it's going to create new supply orders out into the future over time based on the simulation that we're doing. The demand allocations, again, are going to take our forecasted demand. We're spreading it evenly across each day of the week, and it's kind of reflecting the way demand would normally come in. The projection tab now is the one that looks forward. So even though we've got a promotion coming on this one, this item is actually over top of green. So we have no reason to be worried about this. So again, just because it's got an alert doesn't necessarily mean you have to take an action. It's going to really help us have visibility to say both of these items are really in plenty good position. We don't need to take action against these. They're going to behave fine. Actually, that promotion will help us pull things down a bit. It's not really that big of a distortion. It's only a little over 2x the normal weekly demand, but we should be good to go on that one. But let's look at some of these other items, because these are more substantial. And if we scroll out, we'll see where they're alerting. Again, this is within that 13-week horizon we set. We can see we've got a big promotion coming up on the week of August 17th. And maybe we're campaigning a number of products for a given event. It could be a sporting event. It could be some other retail channel induced activity where they wanted to highlight a discount on our products to help drive some additional sales in their grocery store, things like that. These would be things that we'd want to take a look at. So let's look at this big one, because it's a big runner and it's got a huge distortion in its demand. In this case, we see that we've got a peak demand of 117,000 cases against our average of 43,000 cases. So clearly this is almost 3x what our normal demand pattern would look like. If we look at that from a property standpoint, we can see that represents about, say, 9 days of additional supply that we're going to need to cover this incremental promotional demand that we're going to have in that period. So this is something that we really need to be concerned about, because as well, it's going to cause a disruption from an inventory standpoint. So we'll see the same item in the projected inventory tab with a critical status on it. And it's because during this week, we've got promotional activity. Even though the badges are dark red, which means it's negative, it's because on a given day in that period, we were actually underwater. The simulation would take the buffer values negative. So this is important because we want to make sure that we can take a corrective action against that. So in this case, what we would be looking at is what do we have to do to correct for this? And what we would in this case do is generate something called a cycle day adjustment factor. So, and this is all part of the demand-driven MRP method. You can see that we've created an adjustment factor here. The event happens on the week of the 17th. And so let's go ahead and edit this one. Let's say that that was originally planned for the 10th, but now it's going to be the 17th. We'll go ahead and save this. And then what we want to do is assign that item that we were looking to include that adjustment factor. So that was stock number 150971. And we'll go ahead and update the part record now to include that item or that adjustment factor. So we go to our part editor, we can quickly scroll down, to the cycle day adjustment factor. We're going to select the August promotion, and we'll go ahead and save that. And what's going to happen now is because we've addressed this item to this, it's going to resimulate just that item. And when we come back and look at our projected inventory levels, we're going to see that we've made an adjustment into the buffer projection that's going to be valuable for us here. You'll see this is going to switch from being critical now to where it's not even going to be alerting. It's going to be down here in this category. You can see the buffer change now because of the use of the cycle day adjustment factor. It triggers a resupply order earlier in time to cover that promotional demand, which is happening the week of the 17th. You can see how steep this line is, reflecting that there was a much heavier rate of demand during that period. The reason it comes earlier is because we have to offset for the lead time of the item. So that cycle day adjustment factor, while it was configured for August 17th, is actually going to pull it back earlier by the lead time of the item. So if I have, as we saw in the promotion report, different items, if these different items have different lead times, it's going to ensure that it triggers that adjustment earlier to ensure that they're going to be made available by the time we get into that promotional period. This would obviously also then have an impact on our rough cut capacity planning. And if we saw that there was a distortion in our rough cut capacity planning, we may need to pre-build a little bit earlier because perhaps it's going to consume too much of that. And we'll get to the RCCP module here in just a moment. But this is, again, the idea. Let's focus on the exceptions. Let's use S&OP as kind of our radar screen in the cockpit of an airliner, where otherwise the plane is flying on autopilot. We're letting the demand-driven operating model operate and respond to actual demand because the buffers have been configured correctly. And instead of trying to get the whole organization all wound up around the axle, trying to get all of this S&OP alignment and consensus on a demand plan and all these factors, let's use this more to take a lighter approach and be configuring and adjusting where needed. Otherwise, let the system do the job for us. So it's a really much more productive, more effective way of approaching the concept of sales and operations planning when you approach it from a demand-driven adaptive enterprise kind of a format. So we talked about rough cut capacity planning. Let's give that a quick look here. Oh, finally, projected supply. These are the supply orders that are coming for that production line. We're sorted here for all the items that run on production line 1. So these values as we go in time are going to be really driving the capacity requirements as we go forward. The rough cut capacity planning, again, we set filters and alerts that indicate if we've got capacity issues. In fact, here we're going to look at line 2, and we can see we've got some badges. This one early in time, we're probably going to manage this by pulling some production earlier or later. So we've got an excess in our resource load graph. Some of the volume for that week could be delayed to the following week. So the planner would probably say, hey, we're going to manage that by just adjusting some of the request dates for some of those orders. Your other tactics would be to add shift time, to use an alternate routing. So there's going to be a number of different factors that we can utilize to kind of configure. And again, in rough cut planning, we're not trying to create a schedule and confirm it way out into the future. we're just looking for exception conditions. You can see the week of the 10th, right? That's the week that that adjustment factor was going to trigger incremental production for those promotional items. And we can see that reflected right here. The good news is, and we haven't approved all of the items, by the way, we haven't applied adjustment factors for all of those items that are on promotion, but we've got time the week ahead, so we could make those adjustments happen a week earlier. That would pull the production capacity in earlier and would really allow us to avoid this overload that we've got here. So this is a great way to reflect those kind of changes and illustrate kind of how we can utilize the tool to make those adjustments. So in fact, why don't we do that? Let's go ahead and we'll go in now and we'll edit this adjustment factor and move this order 1 week earlier. It's just going to say like the promotional event starting sooner. When we update this, it's going to go back and resimulate the projection based on the APM for that item. And what we should see is that the rough cut capacity planning load is going to come a little bit earlier, and we should have a more balanced view then for that item in that period. And in fact, that's what's happened here. We had a big overload on the week of the 10th. Now we've got a more balanced view. We're still a little bit heavy on the 17th, but we can probably manage that kind of in flight. Not a big concern because we're kind of within those parameters. So this is a great illustration of how we can use this. Focus on the exceptions, make the subtle adjustments we need to, put those adjustment factors out there into the future. They give us visibility. If we refresh this view, we'll see that there are items that have been applied to this, so we can monitor our adjustment factors. A good discipline in this model is to keep track of these adjustments you've made, make sure that those campaigns are still going to be running. If they're changed, maybe the date's going to move in or out, maybe the volume expectation is going to change. We have the ability to keep track of those factors and stay on top of them. A final view here is the projected projected buffer trend report. And this is going to show us the evolution. I talked about how in many clients we start out with a preponderance of over top of green, and over time we whittle that down while getting inventory into alignment. So this would be a very traditional or typical view you would see in your buffer trend graph. It's a 2-axis graph. The left side shows the distribution of your items based on buffer zone that they're in. So in other words, here we had quite a few that were over top of green. While on the right side, we're looking in dollar values at the comparison of the line graph, which is these two lines for inventory and our target inventory levels. So we get a great view of how our working capital is going to be. We're going to expand this to include space projections and other factors as well. So if we're worried about warehouse space, we can also see how our warehouse values are tracking relative to warehouse capacity. So quite a bit of flexibility there to work with. We greatly appreciate your time. I'm going to go back to the presentation now, and we can close up and take the questions and answers. But hopefully you've seen that we can really align the solution to fit very well in a food and beverage environment. So now let's go back to the presentation and we'll take those questions. There's a ton of information you'll be getting this presentation. The Demand-Driven Institute has done a wonderful job of promoting the ideas of Ddmrp and the demand-driven adaptive enterprise out into the marketplace. They have tons of resources there you can get access to. And as well, we have a bountiful range of resources in our resource library on our website. There's contact information where you can get in touch with us in this fashion. So with that, I'm going to stop and I'm going to go to our question panel and see what kind of questions we've got come in. Okay. Let's see, how do you define the short duration for sales data? How short is it actually? Great question. So in Ddmrp, we're responding to demand due today and in the past. What we think of as sales orders are going to be those that are firm, right? So in some cases, clients will know that within the first 2 days or so of today, they can count on those sales orders. So there's actually a setting in the system where you can automatically include those in your planning equation, and you don't have to wait for them to be qualified as a spike. Very infrequently used, but typically those are going to be very, very short horizons. For most companies, it's going to depend on what your order book looks like from your customers, right? In engineered order environments, it's typically going to be longer and a little bit more reliable in that sense. In consumer goods, it's very much driven by the
retail trade and how you're actually servicing into the markets. Another good question. In a lot of scenarios, consumption data is not shared by large retail stores. How is Ddmrp implemented in such a case? So in this case, yeah, you don't frankly need POS data. Quite honestly, I think there's a lot of fervor in Industry 4.0 around, getting all of this demand sensing data. In actuality, as you saw with that chart on the bullwhip effect, unless we change our management system, it doesn't really matter because we're introducing through forecasting a lot of distortions that are not helping us. So consumption data would actually be what your shipments would be, how you ship data. That would be your demand that's in our history that will use the average daily usage value that are sizing the buffer. The actual demand orders that are coming in are the true orders from your customers that are going to be commercially transacted. So it may be through a food distributor that buys your product and then distributes to their market. It could be coming directly from a large commercial retail chain, like the large consumer goods, or in the US, it'd be Kroger, Safeway, companies like that, Publix. And so those are going to be the demand figures. Next question, is there a vendor management feature? Yeah, in the sense that we have two things. On the inbound side, you can allow customer or your vendors to actually monitor their stocks in your instance of R+. So they can collaborate. If they are owning the material at that level and they're maintaining it in their own system, you can actually import their data into our environment. We support imports from multiple different ERPs. So you would be able to do that as well. On the outbound end, if you're holding stock in a vendor where you're the vendor responsible for managing the inventory, yes, you could give the customer access to those stock positions and then be posting their demand against and usage of those materials, by adjusting the inventory levels or what have you. So a wide range of options on that front to be able to handle those kind of functions. One last question here. What happens if customers are building own buffers which are reduced later? Does Ddmrp respond well to it? Absolutely. So let's say your customers are buffering stock, and as they start to manage according to demand-driven rules, it actually improves your accuracy of your demand signals. And so your buffers will start to, if they're shrinking their buffers, and lowering their rate of consumption, it will start to bring your buffer levels down. One of the best stories I've heard from clients is when they talk about, after implementing Ddmrp, how some of their worst vendors became some of their best. And what was the change? Well, they had put Ddmrp buffers around those materials that supplier was bringing in to protect against that variation. And all of a sudden that vendor became more performant. Why? Because they started getting a more reliable signal. They stopped getting bullwhipped by the customer that had implemented Ddmrp. And so it really helped harmonize their relationship with those vendors. I think we've covered the key questions that were out there. I want to thank everybody for your participation today. Again, you'll be getting access to this content as well as a recording of the webinar. Again, you can also get access to the session that we ran last week with Coca-Cola Beverages of Africa. I hope you found this all very informative. Stay healthy and stay safe. And we hope to work with you on your demand-driven journey. Have a great day. Thanks, everybody.